Yeah. So,
So, evening all to this month's planning meeting. First item on the agenda is to receive apologies from absence, and I think you've said one from Malcolm Glenn and one from David Fuller.
that's right. Yeah.
Representations from interested parties. I'm not sure whether Robert's here simply to observe or whether he's here to contribute something before we start.
No, could I contribute something, please?
Of course you can.
It's about the application at 61 Hillfield Road. Perhaps I could just read out the comment that my parents submitted to ENC.
Right.
We wish to raise an objection to aspects of the above planning application. Our property is situated immediately to the east of the property in question. 1, we object to the use of cedar wood on the sides of the single-storey extension as opposed to the more appropriate brick used on the proposed extension to the existing garage. Cedar wood is out of keeping with the honey-coloured brick used in the construction of these properties. There is a pronounced mismatch between the two colours when cedar wood is new, and this becomes accentuated after it has weathered. 2, we object to the large window on the eastern side of the proposed rear extension as it results in a permanent and unexpected loss of privacy to the bedroom of our property with a southwesterly facing window. The current alignment of the two properties is such that none of the living accommodation of either property is overlooked from the living accommodation of the other. This would change as a result of this proposal. The proposed window is not needed to provide daylight on account of the large bifold door facing the school playing fields and the lantern. 3, we object to the size of the proposed extension. Whilst we appreciate the particular need for accessible accommodation, the proposed extension occupies a disproportionate part of the rear garden and far exceeds the link to the kitchen which we were anticipating. 4, on an estate where there is a degree of aesthetic uniformity and relatively small gardens, this could set an unfortunate precedent. We should be grateful if the above points could be taken into consideration in reaching your decision.
Thank you for that, because when I looked on the website on Sunday, there weren't any objections, I don't think, there from the public. So thank you for making me aware of that. Oh, good evening, Malcolm. I think we'd already accepted your apology, so we'll cross that off the list.
I apologise for coming.
No, please don't do that. Right. Well, in the absence of there being any other representations, can we move on to any declarations of interest? And firstly, any disclosable pecuniary interests?
None.
And secondly, any other interests?
No.
None. The minutes of the meeting that was held on the 2nd of February were circulated. Present at that meeting were myself, Councillor Fuller, Councillor Chesser and Councillor Humphreys. Those of you who were there and have read the minutes, anybody like to say aye? Yes, Councillor Chesser. Seconded by Councillor Humphreys. I was the only other person who was there. All those in favour, please show. That effectively is unanimous. Right, well, that moves us hopefully rather swiftly on to the actual planning applications themselves. Just bear with me whilst I make my way through to them. Right, this is definitely a case, A, of deja vu with a couple of these applications, and B, what is it about extensions this month? Because we've got 5 applications and all 5 relate to extensions. And the first is a reapplication. It's a reapplication in respect of 4 New Road, which in fact is the home of former Councillor Dainter, for a double-storey rear extension. Now, the application had come before us at our meeting on the 6th of October, and we didn't object to it. But for reasons that I have to accept I'm not clear about, the application was withdrawn in November and now comes back. And I must confess, I haven't particularly noted where the differences, if any, are. The application no longer refers to the replacement of the garden wall as part of the sort of substantive heading of the application. It just talks about the rear extension. But in fact, just as with the previous application, the plan is to replace the garden wall this with an extension from the new extension through to the end of the garden for the wall itself. The one change I did notice in connection with the application was the original application we looked at in October said that the extension would be of facing bricks and roof tiles basically to match the existing. The new application indicates that a form of slate cladding is to be used, although the actual roof slates will be as per the existing building. There is an existing single-storey side extension that would be replaced with a two-storey extension to what is a three-storey property. It's got a basement area as well. It has a sloping roof, and I've given some dimensions in the paperwork I've circulated. Side windows at ground and first floor level, and at the rear a three-paned window at ground floor level and a two-paned full-length 1600 wide window with a Juliet balcony at the first floor level. And I think the Juliet balcony was there in the original application, as I recall. Doesn't appear to be any issue having said that with overlooking. No change to the front elevation. And as at Sunday, although my confidence in this has now been entirely knocked by Robert's observations about a later application, but as of Sunday, there were no objections or comments posted. So, does the fact that this is now going to be have this form of cladding put on it alter our views at all about the application?
Not for me.
As long as it doesn't catch fire, I haven't got any problem with it.
Well, I don't. It's not a wooden style of cladding, unlike one we're going to look at in due course. But so I wouldn't have thought it's flammable. I think it's always quite difficult, actually, isn't it, to gauge these things. Occasionally, you see them coming up in the flesh, so to speak, and you think, "Good Lord, that doesn't look a bit like what I thought it was going to look like when you just saw the drawings." I didn't feel that there was anything particularly objectionable about what was being proposed for the aesthetics of the building, if I could call it that. And although I suppose it's quite a prominent building on the corner of New Road and Rock Road, I doubt that it would have a huge impact visually, but I could yet be proved wrong, I suppose.
I mean, my only comment, Chair, on that theme is that that end. I mean, it is a bit of a hodgepodge down there anyway, and I think it's my view as just an aesthetic really is that it will improve rather than detract from what's already along that road. I can't see as it making any difference except beneficial.
Yeah, I remember that when I commented on this application in October, I said that for whatever reason, somehow this extension seemed to have the effect of making the overall thing look smaller than it was. Strangely enough, I'm not sure that I actually got the same impression when I was looking at the drawings, and yet I can't see why that would be so. But I can't see any basis for objection. Lisa, you've got your hand up.
We've got a Julian Watts Russell that's entered the waiting room, is wishing to be admitted into the meeting. Is that okay to go ahead with that?
Yes, by all means. We'll carry on with this application, and then we'll see if we can work out why Julian's joined us. So, anybody got any objections to this, or shall we simply record it as no objection?
No objection from me.
No
No
objection.
objection from me.
No objection to that one. And the next application is in relation to 15 New Road. Now, strangely enough, this one also is coming back for a second bite. This is described as a new single-storey rear extension with new monopitched roof above an existing single-storey side extension. So we've got sort of side and rear. When the application came before us previously, which was in January, again, we didn't object to it, but it was framed rather differently. On that occasion, the applicant was looking for what's called a certificate of lawful use. I had surmised that this was on the basis that the extension that was there had never actually had planning permission to be there in the first place. So in trying to extend the property, they were trying to kind of regularize the position by getting the certificate. Well, as a ploy, that failed because although we didn't object to it, ENC did, and they refused that. So back it's come again, this time no references to certificates of lawful use. It is simply a straight application for the extension. And I seem to recall that when it came before us before, Councillor Humphreys was making comments because the little drawings showing the building showed a Porsche parked outside it, as opposed to something slightly more mundane. So the property, as I say, has an existing extension and conservatory, which is going to be redeveloped to create a single-storey extension to the south, that's rear-facing towards the garden, and to the east, side-facing towards number 17 New Road, which thereby extends both lounge and kitchen. Extension will have buff bricks to the front and rear walls, with the side of the extension to be painted render with red brick quoins. That is, I think, as per the previous application. Sloping roof will have double lapped grey slates, 4 rear-facing Velux roof lights with 2 Velux roof lights to the side. Windows, white PVC-U, in line with the existing. To the side, 1 double window. White PVC-U bifold doors to the rear from the kitchen. Soffits and rainwater goods, also white PVC-U. And I've given some dimensions. Again, for what it's worth, there were no objections or comments posted on the website when I looked at it on Sunday. As I say, we didn't object before, and I'm not sure that there's any significant change to what is being applied for this time around, other than, as I say, they've just dropped the idea of asking for a certificate of lawful use and just ploughed on with the application, which I think we treat on its own merits. If we're going to be consistent, presumably we aren't going to object.
No objection from me.
Objection.
No objection.
No,
I can't see any
Right.
difference.
no objection all round. Now that brings us on to 61 Hillfield Road. And first of all, I'll correct the little comment on the bottom of my sheet, which says there are currently no comments on the ENC planning portal, because either there is one now, or if there isn't, there will be, which has always been the caveat that we've always had to mention, that there's sometimes a bit of a time lag. Now, the existing walls of this property are buff bricks. The extension is to have bricks to match. Brown pan tiles to the extension roof, also to match the existing windows and doors, white UPVC. In the extension, white UPVC and aluminium for some reason. New rear door and cedar cladding, which will be around the sort of rear door area and to the side elevation of the garage. The detached garage would be incorporated into the existing property, with part of it being converted to living accommodation, essentially a bedroom with an ensuite shower room and some extended family space. As I put on the thing, because it simply is not clear from the paperwork that's on the ENC planning portal, what I couldn't tell is how many bedrooms the property would have once this additional bedroom area was created, because as they were not doing anything to first floor level, there's no plan of the property to show me how many bedrooms there are on the first floor. The odd thing about it was when I looked at the drawings, the drawings show the front garage doors as if they're still there, albeit that we've now got this extension, all of which seemed very bizarre to me. And my note was that by reducing the garage from a double garage to a single garage, there would be a reduction in on-site parking. And it's not known how many on-site parking spaces the property would need to comply with the requirements of highways, although there would appear to be on-site parking for 3 cars in total, one in the what's left of the garage, which becomes a single garage, and then 2 potentially on the driveway. So we've also now heard various other points raised, concern around the cladding from one of the neighbours because it's out of keeping with other properties on that estate, and certainly from my recollection of that estate it would be. Perhaps a complaint that the size is over large, and an issue around overlooking from one of the windows on the eastern side, which I have to say wasn't entirely apparent to me when I was looking at the drawings, which only goes to show that it's quite tricky sometimes working off drawings, because what you don't get with the drawing usually is the adjoining property clearly shown so that you can work out whether there is or isn't likely to be an overlooking issue. So, thoughts?
Just my initial thought is, I think I think this sort of extension is already happening on that estate, actually, David. I mean, I know it's not on the Hillfield Road, but is it Creed Road or one of the other ones? I know you can see it from the George car park over the fence, and there's a very, very large extension on the back of one of the houses there with aluminium 4x5 doors, and it is cedar clad. So I think that sort of aesthetic is already creeping into that estate. So that's one point. I think that's a very fair comment on being overlooked. I think, you know, from my point of view, and I think that's, and that for the overlooking bit and the parking, that's where my objection would come. Everything else, I think, is an aesthetic that is already happening and already started. And there are several, in fact, there are several houses now in and around that top end of Oundle that are cedar clad, and it's a trend that will continue. In fact, there's, as we've already seen, the ones down St. Peter's, the trend is already there and it's already happening. So that's an aesthetic that I don't know if we can put up any, you know, I don't think there's any defense about that sort of stuff anyway.
Councillor Chester, any thoughts?
Nothing, no, I don't. If it's happening, isn't it? I mean, what I do object to is if they want to build out onto the land that forms part of the roadside, which we've also had people asking for at times. But
yes, it didn't appear to me that was an issue.
I don't think that's an issue there, is it?
I don't think so from recollection. Councillor Glenn, any thoughts?
No.
Yeah,
The property.
I mean, it is difficult because, as we will see with the later application, highways have popped up on that one and said they potentially have an issue with it because by adding bedroom space to the property, additional parking space is required, and it frankly wasn't clear whether the property would have sufficient parking space. Well, that's easily got round on one level, because if you don't actually make it clear how many bedrooms you're starting with, you can't actually do the calculation to work out how many parking spaces you need. So all we could do would be to indicate a concern, which I think is a general concern we have, that if you are converting garages in whole or in part into living accommodation, one needs to be very careful to ensure that there remains existing on-site parking, because we do not want to displace it onto the roads, particularly perhaps on that estate. As a general point, I know that in the past we've also made observations, on every occasion, it has to be said unsuccessfully, that when that estate, amongst others, was set up, it had a balance. so many 4 bedrooms, so many 3 bedrooms, and so on, as part of the overall plan. And then, of course, the whole thing is gradually derailed as properties become extended, and therefore the base of smaller units diminishes. But having made that point repeatedly, it's never been one that's been accepted by ENC planning. Maybe worth waiting until we have Northamptonshire and then make the point all over again as a sort of new tack, but it probably won't work this time. But I think we have some concerns with regard to this. So if we draw attention to the fact that we would want any overlooking issues to be dealt with, either by requiring any window that is capable of overlooking to become frosted glass or something like that, so you can't actually see out through it, or alternatively to actually insist that there is no window space at all where it would overlook, and that would potentially get around that particular worry. And then I think we simply draw attention to our concerns at the loss of car parking space, and whether or not there remains adequate parking for the number of bedrooms that that property will have. Does that seem a sensible way of taking it forward?
Well, the only thing is, if you're not sure how many bedrooms there are, it's the number of bedrooms the property is capable of having. In other words, if they're putting in a study, which might become a bedroom.
Well, here we know it's a bedroom because they're definitely saying we're adding a bedroom with a shower room off it.
Okay.
So we know that there's an extra bedroom. What we don't know is how many it started with. So we can't apply the highways formula to it.
Okay.
So I think we can make the observation. It may transpire that there is adequate car parking, in which case no problem. But what I wouldn't like it to do is slip under the radar because we didn't pick it up. And certainly as of Sunday, highways haven't picked it up, which, bearing in mind the fact that they do pick up on another one in due course, was slightly bizarre. But there we are. Councillor Chesser.
I'm just thinking about the size of this, and we have in the past commented that sometimes extensions are too big for the plot, you know, overdevelopment, if you like.
Had it not been for the objection that we heard about, when I looked at the plan, it wasn't one of those where it leapt out at me that it was potentially overdevelopment on the site. But then I don't live next door to it. And I'm not as familiar with it as the person who's objecting, but there again, you know, people who are affected by property development don't always necessarily look at it as objectively as the outsider. We know that that issue has been raised. We could include within our comments the fact that we note that there is local concern about whether this might amount to overdevelopment, which kind of just flags it up. And then if ENC are worried, they can leap on that particular bandwagon as well. Would that suffice?
Yeah, I think that, yeah.
Because
it is something that we do get concerned with.
We do.
It's not a new thing.
All right. So it's a sort of very qualified response to that one. We have a number of concerns. We'll work on a wording in due course. The next one is 5 Ashton Road, yet another extension, in fact, yet another 2-storey side extension with a 1-storey rear extension and a new porch. In fact, this just makes the whole building appreciably bigger. The walls to the extension are to be rendered to match the existing walls. Similarly, the extension roof will have plain tiles to match the existing. Windows and doors, white PVC-U, also to match. As with the rainwater goods, new roof windows to the south elevation, an increase from 3 to 4 bedrooms, and here is the comment by Highways, which required evidence that there would be 3 parking spaces on the site, each needing to be 3 by 5.5 meters, in view of the increase in the number of bedrooms. And I have to say, the way the plans are drawn, it really wasn't that clear how much parking space there might be. So I guess that we can, in responding to this, make a similar point that we are concerned as to whether or not, in view of the increase in the number of bedrooms, there would be sufficient space on site. I'm afraid I haven't had an opportunity to drive down Ashton Road and try and figure it out for myself. And I was a bit disappointed, as I say, that the drawings that were submitted didn't, frankly, make it easy enough for me to come to a view, which presumably was the highways point, because presumably they too were struggling to work it out. If it hadn't been for that issue, I wouldn't have had any particular concerns about the actual building works, if I could call it that. Again, any thoughts from anybody else?
Just as a comment, you know, I agree with you, David, and I think the important thing is, once again, especially in its where it is in the town, I think parking is absolutely crucial to this. You know, that we must make this point about these developments, because if there is a legal framework and a law about this, then everyone must uphold that.
Malcolm, any thoughts?
No, except that I think that Clive is right. There's so much parking all over the pavements, all over the verges, that we have to be very careful of this issue.
I was looking at Val, but she suddenly disappeared from her chair just as I went to go to her. Well, we'll just wait a minute. You're back. I just turned to talk to you and you weren't there.
Nobody ever phones me, ever.
Right. Do you have a view?
No, I don't. But except I would have thought that bit of Ashton Road was only what houses on one side anyway. There's probably plenty of parking in the road, isn't there?
Well, you're right. Yes, there would only be one building on one side of the road. I mean, it's not the world's widest road.
No,
and of course, if a certain development takes place,
well, that will change it.
Down there's going to be a lot more traffic coming up, and keeping cars off that stretch of road would probably be desirable. That's the only observation.
Those houses got quite large front gardens down there, don't they?
Yes, I mean, as I say, unfortunately, the drawings, and I may be maligning him, but I think it was Mark Benz who actually is the person behind this particular one. If I've got that wrong, I apologise to him and whoever it was. But I was actually a bit surprised and disappointed that it just wasn't clear enough to me what kind of parking there was on site. So I think we'll just make the observations around the parking issue again, and see where that takes us to. That brings us on to the last of the 5 applications, and by now the trend is set. A single-storey rear extension, the removal of a conservatory, and a single-storey front extension, this time to 18 Clifton Drive. This involves the extension of the existing front porch to the west to enlarge the dining room and hall. Again, I've given some dimensions in the papers I've produced. To the rear, the existing conservatory removed and replaced with a single-storey flat-roofed extension, which is significantly higher than the current conservatory. The existing double garage would be reduced to a single garage, here we go again, to create a store and treatment room. And that's exactly what it's called, a treatment room. Now, I don't know the applicant, or at least I don't think I do, somebody called Davis, whether they are involved in physiotherapy or, sports injuries or any of those kind of areas, and they're going to actually be doing work from home, or whether this is for their own use. I'm not sure, but that's how it's described. What it isn't is an extra bedroom. So it's a store and a treatment room. The utility, however, is altered. It creates a smaller utility and then puts in a shower room. Now, the ultra suspicious amongst us might be thinking, well, if you're going to put a shower down there, does that mean that eventually things that are described as storerooms or other rooms become bedrooms? But actually the layout doesn't entirely work, because where the shower room is, it is very clearly off the utility room rather than off the store or treatment room. Councillor Chesser.
If it's going to be a treatment room, that sounds as if people are going to visit the property. And it is a cul-de-sac.
It is. It's right at the end. There's 4 properties kind of in a line.
Across the end.
At the end of Clifton Drive.
Yeah.
And you're right, if this is going to be used commercially, then it will generate traffic in and out of Clifton Drive, which is not the world's greatest exit out onto Benefield Road. And then, of course, there's the question of where people visiting there would park. So I think it's worth raising the question, is this treatment room purely for the use of the inhabitants of the house or the occupants of the house, or is it intended to be used in some kind of commercial way?
Those 4 houses are very tight because it slopes down at that end of Clifton Drive, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
Yep.
Yes, you're quite right. So I said, although no extra bedrooms are created by the proposed works, 1 on-site parking space will clearly be lost because we go from a double garage to a single garage. But as the drawings don't provide any information to make the number of bedrooms clear, and that's the second time I've complained about that in one evening. Again, I was unable to apply the highways formula and work out whether or not there might be an issue, not because of the creation of extra bedrooms, but by the diminution in the amount of parking space in proportion to the number of bedrooms. Existing materials: walls of brick with the extension brick block and render, roofing to match the existing concrete tiles, and rather, as you might have anticipated, windows, doors, etc., white PVCU. Well, existing ones are white PVCU. Actually, the application describes the new ones as being coloured PVCU. It doesn't tell us what colour. And I must admit, I would be slightly perplexed if somebody were to put in something other than white, because it would just look odd to me, but there you go. There were no objections or comments on the portal as of Sunday. So I've made a couple of points already. Anybody want to kick off with comments on this one? Yes, Malcolm.
If they're going to use it for commercial purposes, haven't they got to get change of use?
Well, certainly if it was going to be used in effect purely for commercial purposes, yes, they would. We had this conversation 2 or 3 months ago, I recall, because I flagged up a property in New Road, and indeed I think one in Victoria Road, where businesses ancillary to the main residential part of the building were operating. One was a cycle repair place and the other one was selling pizzas, in fact. And we raised it with the NC, and their response was that if it was very much ancillary to its primary use as a residential property, then you wouldn't necessarily need planning permission for change of use. Well, I guess it's all in the question of numbers and everything else as to whether that is or isn't an issue. We could certainly flag up our concern as to whether change of use is needed, and we can certainly flag up our concern that if it is going to be operated in some commercial way, it's bound to generate extra traffic in and out of Clifton Drive, and it's potentially going to create some parking issues in Clifton Drive. So there's 3 things before we start.
Just, I mean, it's unfortunate they put, or unfortunately they were honest enough to say treatment room, I think if they just left it as bedroom, no one probably would be any the wiser. And once again, it is the parking issue is crucial to this. I mean, I think if you're losing, and now they've said treatment room, then it would indicate to one that there are going to be clients parking around in and around it, depending on how busy they are. Of course, I don't know, but this is that's nothing to do with planning at all. I mean, these are the times we live in. Everyone's starting or having to work from home or create jobs or whatever they have to do. I mean, I think parking is my only objection.
Anybody else? Anything else? Right. That's the last of the actual plans. Our responses are slightly tricky because then there are a series of observations and questions almost. I'll try and help you out, Lisa, by putting something together and emailing it over to you.
Thank you.
So that's the planning applications on the agenda. The planning outcomes are shown on your agenda. And of course, one of those was the refusal of the certificate of lawful use for 15 New Road, which we've looked at in its new guise. Other than that, nothing particularly that we'd flagged up before to cause us concern. That brings us on to the one substantive remaining item on the agenda, but an important one. Full Council sent back to this committee the proposed response to the ENC Local Plan Part 2. The intention being that this committee could perhaps spend a little bit more time than we had available at Full Council in considering how we might respond. And as you know, I had actually put together a response, at least in part, that went before Full Council, but it was really more for information, and they've now sent the whole thing back. Now, just because I have drafted something doesn't mean to say that it's set in stone, that I might be in a minority of one about what I've written here. So, please don't feel that you may not seek to criticize it or seek to revise it. But it only, in a sense, goes so far anyway as a document, because perhaps 3/4 the way through it or thereabouts, there is a very simple two-liner, but unfortunately quite a complicated piece of work, because it says here, include here an analysis of the evidence for and against these 3 sites. And those 3 sites, so that everybody is clear, are the land off Cotterstock Road and St. Peter's Road, the land off St. Christopher's Drive, and the land off Stoke Doyle Road by the cemetery. And I'd said here, include an analysis of the evidence for and against those 3 sites and the evidence for and against the alternative sites from the Oundle Neighbourhood Plan. Because as councillors will recall, our neighbourhood plan, which failed at examination, proposed that we should have development on 2 other main sites. One, land north of Bennefield Road, which might explain why Mr. Watts Russell has joined us, and the other, land off Herne Road, Philip Rose's site, where the intention was to have both residential development and a lovely cricket pitch. And I have suggested that if we're going to complain that essentially the local plan part 2 is flawed because their analysis of the sites was wrong, we can't just say it's wrong. We must say why we think it's wrong. And although there's some reference to that in earlier parts of the document that I've drafted, it potentially almost a cut and paste job to shift into this document the appropriate parts from our own neighbourhood plan analysis of those sites, which will of course make this quite a lengthy document by the time it's finished, because the work that was done on analysing the various sites was quite comprehensive. There's also the point that at an earlier stage, when we were leaping up and down about the local plan, we had pointed out certain flaws as far as we were concerned in it. For example, issues that suggested that there might be a plan to build on the Prince William playing fields when there was no such plan at all. So that area isn't finished, and I was hoping that somebody who had worked on the neighbourhood plan and our work around the earlier iterations of the local plan might be in a position to help me out and incorporate into this document an appropriate part. And happily the mayor attended this meeting, and even more happily he's now got his hand up, which I hope means he's about to volunteer.
Yes, that was a volunteer. Yeah, so essentially the document that I've drafted and shared with you previously, but let me take that away, and rather than give them another 1,000 pages of information, get it down into something that there's a chance of somebody reading. Yeah.
Well, that's really helpful. It was what I was rather hoping somebody would come forward to do, because I just didn't have the time to try and wade through all of that, and I wasn't as familiar with it as some. Now, before I move on to the town strategies bit of the local plan, clearly our main focus was around the housing issues. And it may be that other councillors want to have input into what I had already drafted, whereby I had gone through the various paragraphs of the local plan part 2 and put various comments down, as you have seen. And one of the reasons for doing it that way is because there's an awful form that you have to fill in when you're making your submission, though I think we'll almost certainly have to do it by reference to please see a next document, because there's just no way you're going to fit it into their format easily. But somebody will actually need to work through that. But I don't think there's more than relatively a few minutes or maybe an hour's work on actually making sure that the form element of this is complete. Councillor Robinson, you had your hand up again.
Yeah, so just in terms of the other document they've given us is the terms for making objections, aren't there?
Yes.
So the three basic ones: legal compliance, compliance with statutory duty to cooperate, and soundness. And I think our objection comes under the soundness category. And then under soundness itself, it has that it's positively prepared and it's consistent with the relevant strategies, which it probably is consistent with the strategies. It's justified with it and effective, and then consistent with national strategy. So I think, our thing is that, it's not justified, because they say it has to take in appropriate strategy, taking into account reasonable alternatives. And so under the reasonable alternatives, we can add everything that we want. As you raised there, David, the long stay car park, them saying that it was underutilized. Well, the alternative strategy is it's not underutilized.
Yes, and clearly in terms of the sites, we're going to say that they didn't properly consider the alternatives, and had they looked at them properly, they'd have actually come to a different conclusion. The extraordinarily frustrating thing about all of this, however, is that whatever we say about the local plan part 2, what it doesn't do is get rid of the 2 outline planning permissions that already exist for 2 out of the 3 sites that they wanted to allocate in the plan. And therefore we're left with this rather bizarre scenario. There is an argument, and in a sense it's the argument I've run in here, but it's a tricky one and we need to think this through, that says, well, actually, because of the numbers that can be put on those 2 developments, the St Christopher's Drive one and the Cotterstock Road one, where the outline plan in respect of Cotterstock Road was for 130 dwellings, and the plan in respect of St Christopher's Drive was 65 dwellings, and then a 65 unit care facility is probably the best way of describing it. So 65 plus 65 is astonishingly 130 again. 130 plus 130 is 260. And as I've observed, at one point in the local plan, they seem to suggest that the residual requirement that we had to meet as a minimum was 242. 260 exceeds 242. I might not be great at maths, but I can work that bit out. The numbers that they came up with was 300. By the sites being suggested at 130 for Cotterstock Road, 100 for St Christopher's Drive, and 70 for Stoke Doyle. Now, there's all sorts of anomalies about that. Clearly, there's the anomaly that the Cotterstock Road, St Peter's Road site involves 2 parishes, Angle and indeed Glapthorne. But the fact that Glapthorne didn't want it, the fact that it's not allocated in Glapthorne's neighbourhood plan, and the fact that it, to all intents and purposes, creates coalescence and puts part of Glapthorne in a wholly isolated position from the rest of the village, probably, when you look strictly speaking at the way that these things are put, may not be, in the eyes of the inspector, a good reason to query this particular proposal. Nevertheless, we've got 130 units there. As I say, we've got the 100 in the local plan part 2, but actually they've already granted permission for 130 units. So do we turn around and argue, well, you've actually got space for 260, you only needed 242, so you don't need the Stoke Doyle Road site at all. The advantage is it keeps down the number of additional dwellings in the town. As another advantage, it removes some of the worries around all that extra traffic trying to come out of this development, turn left into town and have to make their way over the Warren Bridge, and then negotiate its way around the Jesus Church and so on. A possible downside to all of this is, of course, where was the cemetery extension primarily going to come from? Answer: the development of this piece of land by the cemetery. And would we find that we lost that? The one bit of actual advantage that comes out of the local plan part 2 was that the ENC seemed to have nailed their colours to the mast and said, well, what we can do is we can require the developments at the other 2 sites to contribute towards the cemetery extension. A somewhat bonkers proposition, because in fact the developers of the cemetery site were quite prepared to give us the extension without any reference to the other 2 sites at all. An observation we made at an earlier stage may have something to do with the whole idea about whether or not something is or isn't justified. But, you know, do we actually try to argue against the site of Stoke Doyle Road? I suspect that we aren't going to want to positively now advocate for either the site off Herne Road, or indeed the site off Bennefield Road, simply because of the numbers game, and not wanting to see potentially several hundred more houses coming into Oundle in the planned period. But that is a bit of a conundrum as to whether to advance an argument that says you don't need the third site or not, because it's the one possible way of putting in something that might just make a difference. Because if in fact the inspector felt the third site shouldn't be there, we might actually achieve something, bearing in mind we're not going to be able to do anything about the two sites that have already got outline planning permission. So what do people feel about that bit?
Can I ask a question? I mean, I'm a bit late into all this, but the Cosstock Road site, 130 houses, they're not going to count towards all the 242 we got for Oundle because it's outside our borough. Isn't that what the
No. Actually, fortunately, even though potentially 60 of the houses on that site would physically be in the parish of Glapthorne, they would count towards the housing allocation in Oundle. It's a convoluted argument that ENC advance about why that is actually so because of the way that the rules work. But essentially, there is a way of saying that it can count towards Oundle, which is another way, of course, of saying, well, don't worry about it, Glapthorne, because we're not really putting 6 more houses there. The fact that actually you are, the fact that the inhabitants there might want to attend the Glapthorne Primary School, which wouldn't be big enough to cope for the number of children that might be in the 60 houses that might be in the Glapthorne area of it, and all the other problems that would arise. Frustratingly, it seems as if the rules work one way when it suits ENC, and they kind of work the opposite way when again it suits them and doesn't suit anybody else. But the short answer is no, it will count towards the Oundle total, okay, regardless of whether it's in Glapthorne or not. So therefore, we are looking at 130 there that are allocated that actually already have outline planning permission. And I think at best we might get the inspector to say that what ENC should have done is actually not have considered either application. They should have both been regarded as being premature, because it rather drives a coach and horses through the whole idea of having a consultation on a plan, when actually you virtually present a fait accompli and say, well, 2/3 of what we put in here is already happening anyway. So, you might not like it, but tough. Obviously spoken for so long, I've driven everybody into silence.
I think you're absolutely right, David, and once again I thank you for all the amount of work you're putting into this. It's incredible. One of my comments was the same as Malcolm's, in fact, but you've answered that for me now. I find it very, very difficult to not to sort of give up and weep, really, in some cases, because I think no matter what we do, I think we're sort of up against it, and they're just, as I said earlier, many months ago, I think our neighbourhood plan was just a basic blueprint for them to point out all the advantages of whatever they wanted to do, and it seems to be that they're going to sort of follow through, roll this on and on and on, even though we could argue quite convincingly that we've produced 260 houses when they only wanted 242, that they'll just say, well, the rules have changed now, we're going to put another estate on anyway, and you'll just have to lap it up because the whole country's going to have to do it, and it will be that sort of roll on argument. But I think if we can, as Tony said, if we can make sure our argument is absolutely watertight this time, so it does fit perfectly into their boxes. And then, yeah, no, we should go for it, and we should go for it as aggressively as one can in these circumstances.
Can I ask you specifically, though, whether when you say go for it aggressively, that means backing the idea of saying we don't want the third site allocating at all?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we should stick to our guns about this. But you know, I do have these reservations that I think we'll once again beating our heads against a brick wall about some of these planning consents that are already seem to be, because one of the big problems with land in England and everywhere else is that as soon as you put a development in on what is essentially greenfield sites, the land value of the neighboring site goes up because of it's already been developed. And so you instantly inject greed factor into all developments, because as soon as someone sees, oh, well, instead of agricultural land, now my land is now trebled in price because they put a housing estate next to it.
Yeah.
So you have this sort of continual roll on, but that's an aside issue. But it is worrying.
Councillor Chesser, have you got any view on how we play it?
I mean, I'd like to have an idea, but I just feel that they'll do whatever they want anyway. So there's part of me wants to fight this thing like hell, and the other part that thinks, would I be just bashing my head against a brick wall?
Yes, I'm sure we all rather feel
And
that
I think that's probably
that's
how
what
we
the
all.
exercise might be. Nevertheless, of course, we represent the town itself, and what we've got to also try and second guess is what would the town want us to do. And I can't help but feel that what the town would want us to do would be to object to the scale of development that the local plan part 2 would create.
I totally agree with you there. I agree totally.
Yeah, absolutely. We should. Yeah, that's my point about as aggressively as possible. Is we should object as much as we human can and keep on objecting and keep because we don't want to go into a situation where they could just pick it apart again and just say, well, yeah, it's not, you haven't put a valid objection in here, so we just ignore you. I think if we always present a solid case that's based on their rulings, then we not only do we morally have a good position, but we could turn around to the town and say, look, we've followed the rules every single time, and each time they move the goalpost. I think that there is an element of the morality to it that has to be taken into consideration.
Councillor Glenn.
I think, well, apart from the fact we don't want more traffic and things into town, we don't want to be seen to roll over to these people. Otherwise, they'll do it over and over again. So I do think that, even if we're going to fail, we should fight them so they know what's going to happen next time they try it on.
Okay. Well, I think the view seems to be from this committee that the recommendation that we make to full council is going to be along the lines of, in the circumstances, let's reduce the amount of development by taking out the third site. Councillor Robinson, before I go on.
I think just in the terms of what they've asked us for is, do we object to the local plan on the basis of soundness? So in that objection, they don't ask us to put forward an alternative. All they ask us to do is say, do we object to it the way it is? And I think, to my mind, it's enough if we say it's not sound as it is. And that then allows us to start the discussions with the Northamptonshire Council on what the plan for Oundle should be.
Yes, but of course, in saying it's unsound because they got this whole business around alternative sites wrong, then to some extent, we are having a technical argument around the sites, in addition to the sort of broader points that we've made. But yes, you're quite right. We do have to try and ensure that the one area that we can aim at, and Councillor Robinson's right, we might have a whole range of worries about this plan as it stands, but there's only this very narrow basis on which we can actually do something. And that is to turn around and say, actually, it's not sound because your rationale behind it doesn't stack up. And I think we can make a case for that. Whether ultimately it's listened to remains to be seen, but I think we can put up a good show, and at least the town will know that we did. Councillor Robinson.
Yeah, so just what I was looking for earlier, and I found it now. One of the problems we have with Stoke Door Road is that they have it in their 5-year land supply plan for completion by the end of 2025. So that's 80 units they've got on Stoke Door Road locked into their 5-year housing land supply. Yes,
That's true. And it's an interesting conundrum about whether, if they've already included it in the land supply, again, it's a done deal. And again, using part of the rationale behind what's already happened, the argument is, well, in the existing local plan, which is still the rural Northampton and Thrapston plan until it's replaced, both the site off Cotterstock Road and the site off Stoke Door Road were both identified as potential sites for future development. Now, it's been argued by ENC that what that means is that they are kind of pre-identified and pre-approved. Now, I think that stretches the meaning of the English language a hell of a long way. Because it's quite clear, if you read what is actually in our NOTP, it is simply flagging them up as possible sites. It's not saying, yes, these should definitely be the next set of sites to be developed. But that's the way ENC have sought to argue it, and doubtless will do the same in relation to Stoke Door Road. Of course, if you take that logic to its extremes, in identifying those two sites in our NOTP, they said that the Cotterstock Road site was capable of taking 200 dwellings, and bizarrely, they suggested the Stoke Doyle Road site was capable of taking 230 dwellings. 230 plus 200 is 430. So they're not suggesting that they should be as fully developed as they might be in their local plan part 2, relative to what they were suggesting in our NOTP, which does make you wonder a bit about the way that they were put in our NOTP. But what ultimately an inspector makes of all of those strange anomalies, I simply don't know. It would be fun to argue it before him.
Yeah. So I think the argument I'd like to see go forward is that the housing allocation for Oundle is taken out of the local plan 2, and we'll resolve that with the new unitary authority.
Yes, I guess the concern about that, of course, is that if there is no plan, that anybody who has land capable of being developed might turn up and say, well, you haven't got a plan at all. So as this site is available, as it is developable, you ought to be giving me permission.
I'm sure
and that might take us back to the scenario I feared as the sort of nightmare scenario that we had around 1,200 sites identified at call for sites stage. 300 is only a quarter of that, and I'd rather have a quarter of it than all of it, even if I'd rather not have the sites they've allocated and maybe not quite as many. I suspect we could go round and round, but I think we've got a clear steer on a way forward. Tony, if perhaps you and I could liaise so that by the time we get to full council, which is only of course a couple of weeks away, We've got in effect a final draft of all of this, which ideally ought to be circulated a little bit before the meeting to give everybody a chance to look at it, because we aren't going to be wanting to plough through pages and pages of the thing on the evening, and we have no time beyond it. I think the closure of the consultation is about 2 days after our meeting. There is one other area I wanted just to touch upon in relation to this, and that is there is one more specific Oundle-based policy in the local plan. I say it's Oundle-based, of course, as is inevitable with the way this plan works. It relates to the Riverside Hotel, Station Road, Oundle, which is, of course, not in Oundle at all, but in Ashton. And it has a policy, and I sent out, I think it was only last night, and I think it was quite late last night, the wording of policy EN 41, but just to clarify, they say that the policy is redevelopment proposals for the former Riverside Hotel will be supported for the following uses. And then they come up with 3 kind of entirely different potential sets of uses. 1, reinstatement as a restaurant, a public house, a hotel, or tourist accommodation. Secondly, as a training facility and or resource centre. Or thirdly, for small business units, or as it puts it, other potential service employment uses.
What is
Offices,
that?
maybe? I suspect that's what it means.
No.
So pretty wide. And then they say redevelopment schemes should deliver the following outcomes: retention and enhancement of the heritage asset. So they seem to regard it as a heritage asset, the building, although I know that when we tried to argue that perhaps it could get listed and then potentially we could force it to be done up, it wasn't that much of a heritage asset. Nevertheless, I suspect it was rather retained and brought back into beneficial use than flattened as part of a redevelopment. Appropriate flood mitigation measures, including appropriate access and egress arrangements. Don't think anybody would argue with that. Provision for new moorings along the River Nene navigation with direct riparian access. Well, I'm not quite sure about that one. I mean, if you're attending a training facility, are you going to arrive by boat? And I suspect the answer is no, you're not. I could see that it might fit with some of the leisure-based uses, but I'm not quite sure whether provision for new moorings, etc., fits with other uses, unless it's really proposed that these are in some way standalone. And then they talk about improved connectivity for pedestrians and cyclists to the town centre. And then hopefully they put east via the North Bridge, which presumably is the alternative to swimming across the river, and riverside paths. Now, we may be perfectly happy with that policy, or we may not. Of course, it's not just a question of are we happy with it. If we were going to attack it, we have to attack it on the same basis that in some way what it says is unsound. And actually, I'm not sure that you could really argue that it's unsound. It might not be our preferred idea, although certainly it's had planning permissions granted for at least some of those uses over the last 30 odd years, perhaps nearer 40 years now. None of which have ever come to any kind of fruition. I think a lot of people would take the view that it almost wouldn't matter what it was as long as it was something. Perhaps there are 1 or 2 uses that we might cavil at a bit, but I suspect that most people would just think that anything that brings that building back into beneficial use and tidies up therefore the approach to Oundle would be a great idea. But does anybody have any thoughts about whether we make any observations on that or not? Councillor Robinson.
I think go back on the consultation argument that proposal was not put forward at the previous round of consultation on the local plan.
Yeah, well, you could argue on the basis of that. After all, our own plan failed at examination on the grounds of inadequate consultation.
Yep.
something I find absolutely incredible, bearing in mind how much consultation we actually succeeded in doing. And particularly when what we did in latter stages is entirely guided by the advice we received from ENC and acted upon. But there you go, that's another story.
Yeah. So this round of consultation is not for consultation of the content. The previous round should have been consultation of the content, and this was not in the content. So they haven't gone through the correct procedures.
And those are the things that any inspector will be looking for.
Yes. And
That's the
indeed, if
point.
you're going to take up the consultation issue, you might say, why did you ignore what was clearly the overwhelming views within the town about where development should be and what scale it should be and so on, and the benefits that certain developments might have brought to the town, be they cricket pitches, be they festival fields, be they allotments, be they cemetery extensions, be they whatever, most of which seems to have gone out with the bathwater in terms of the local plan part 2, which has only got the cemetery extension in it, so far as I can see, in terms of any real gain to Oundle, when our own plan promised potentially so much more. So we might want to develop that, and I'm wondering, Tony, if in a sense it links to what you were saying, if you'd like to kind of write up that bit and add it into what's already exists.
I'll do that. Yeah, and I will also talk to Ashton Parish Council and see if there's anything they want us to include.
Yep, that's a good idea.
With them.
Right. Anything else on the local plan part 2?
No.
In which case, we'll come back for bite 3 in a couple of weeks' time when we have our full council meeting. That was the last substantive item on the agenda. The only other matter is any other business. I'll simply work my way around the councillors who are present. So Councillor Chesser, you seem to be next to me on the screen.
No.
Councillor Robinson?
No.
Councillor Humphreys?
No.
Councillor Glenn?
No.
Lisa, is there anything we should be talking about at this stage?
No.
I suppose we might just mention, for the benefit of anybody who hadn't noticed, but there is an emergency full council meeting next Tuesday.
Yeah.
So we shall all see each other again fairly soon. Well, on that happy note, I'm going to suggest that we call this meeting to an end. Thank you all for your attendance. Thank you for our guests for your attendance and contribution as well.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.